You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I want to talk about the very important topic of triangulation. Triangulation. When it comes to understanding your story, it is very important to understand the relational dynamics between you, your parents, and any siblings, which is why I often say that one of the things that everyone needs to do eventually in life is draw a triangle. The 3 points of the triangle will represent your primary caretaker 1, primary caretaker 2, and you. Now, imagine an upside down triangle, a triangle that's pointing down. Your 2 primary caregivers are at the top of the triangle, and you are at the bottom. You're the bottom point of the triangle. I want you to either draw or imagine that triangle so that the closeness of the points of the triangle represent the emotional closeness of the relationship between the 2 people. So in an emotionally healthy family, parent 1 and parent 2, primary caregiver 1 and 2, they will be emotionally closer to each other than either one of them is to you, the child. Now, when that is the case, when that's what your triangle looks like, the foundation is set for you to develop what's called a secure attachment. However, sadly, many of us grew up in families in which the triangle looked quite different than that. For example, for me, I was emotionally closer to my mother than my father was to my mother. My mom and I had a much closer relationship than mom had with dad. So, what does that mean for my triangle? My triangle is going to look wonky. Okay. In my triangle, the line connecting me to mom is the shortest line of the triangle. It's the shortest side because we were so tight. We were so close. Now, when your triangle looks wonky, like mine did, the foundation is set for you to experience significant harm. Now, please hear the next sentence. I am not saying that violation is inevitable. I am saying that the setup for violation of the child is present. So if the closest emotional bond in a family is between you and, for example, your mother, then your mother often begins to look to you as a child to meet her adult emotional needs. And that's a very big deal because when that becomes an ongoing pattern, the child has become triangulated. What is triangulation? Let me define it. Triangulation occurs when a parent requires a child to function as an emotional adult by meeting the parent's adult needs and adult wants. Here are the critical questions to consider. As you ponder the possibility, was I triangulated? As you ponder the possibility of triangulation in your family, here are the critical questions to ponder. Number 1, which way did the bulk of the emotional energy flow? Was it from your parent into your heart, or was it from you into your parent's heart? Number 2, I mean, these are all ways of getting at the same thing. Did you receive more, like emotionally? Did you receive more from your parent, or did your parent take more from you emotionally? Were you, number 3, were you required to give to your parent, to one of your parents, to one of your caregivers, or were your caregivers continually giving emotionally to you? I'm not talking about providing for you financially, shelter, food, clothing. I'm talking about the emotional connection. So let's get an example. Suppose you are a 14-year-old girl and your parents don't have a very close relationship, and your dad begins to look to you rather than to his partner, his wife, for connection. Now, of course, please, of course, connection between parents and children is a good and healthy thing. I know that. Unless, and this is a very big caveat, unless the parent uses the child to meet their emotional needs rather than the other way around. Parents and children, this is very important to understand. Parents and children are not peers. Okay, in a healthy parent-child relationship, there is plenty of connection. There is plenty of emotional connection, but the parent never imposes their emotional needs on the child. So the foundation of triangulation, what is it? It's that a parent takes from the child rather than gives to the child. The root problem with triangulation is that a parent looks to the child to meet their adult needs, the parent's adult needs. The parent-child relationship is intended to be non-reciprocal. What does that mean? It means that parents are supposed to give, and children are supposed to receive. The parent-child relationship, it's not intended to be like a mutual and balanced relationship as two adults may have. That's not what a parent-child relationship is supposed to be. So let's put some more flesh on this, some more example, practicality, particularity. Perhaps dad was the parent who always took you to your volleyball and your softball games. Just the two of you. And in the car, you would sometimes have significant conversations. And at times, dad shared how frustrated he was about his relationship with his wife, your mother. A child, please hear this. A child is not supposed to be brought into their parents' marriage. Okay, here's another example. Suppose dad was always working on his car out in the garage. And for some reason, you often found yourself out in the garage working with him, spending time with him, much more frequently than any of your siblings. And your mother or stepmother, whatever your family constellation looked like, your mother never did this. In other words, it was special time between you and your father. Now, this can appear to be innocent, even sweet and good. After all, after all, what's wrong with a father spending quality time with his daughter? Out in the garage, doing fun things together. Nothing is wrong with that. As long as the father is not looking to you to meet his adult emotional needs when you're out there in the garage. But what if your father enjoys your goodness, your presence, more than he enjoys his wife's goodness and his wife's presence? What if your father actually prefers spending time with you over spending time with his wife? Now, look, in these cases, it is very likely that this quote unquote special relationship between you and your dad is deeply harmful to you, the child. Significant damage occurs whenever a parent uses a child to satisfy their adult needs, their wants, their desires. Looking back, when you look back on the relationship, it may feel sweet, but it is actually violating because the daughter is being used as a surrogate spouse, a fill-in for mom. The daughter is being consumed by her father rather than fathered by her father. There is more energy flowing from the child to the adult rather than vice versa. Okay, that's triangulation. Now, look, just bear with me, please. Keep listening. Two important caveats to all of this. Two important caveats. Many couples, including my marriage, okay, many couples go through difficult seasons in which, the two partners don't feel emotionally close to one another. This does not mean that one parent will necessarily begin triangulating a child. All right. The question is, are husband and wife, are the two parents, the two primary caregivers, are they emotionally committed to engaging with one another during the difficult season? If not, if there's distance, if there's withdrawal, okay, if there's separation, if not, the critical question becomes this: does one parent begin to look to a child to satiate their unmet adult emotional needs and wants? Triangulation occurs when parent-child roles get mixed up. It occurs when one parent expects a child to meet their needs as if the child was another adult. So if parent one and parent two don't have a deep emotional connection, and if they're not regularly talking through conflicts and taking responsibility for how they're harming each other and repairing those ruptures, if they're not doing that stuff, then the setup exists for one of the children to be triangulated. Okay, that's caveat number one. Caveat number two, many of you grew up in single parent homes. All right, if you grew up with a single parent, does that mean that you were necessarily triangulated? Of course not. Absolutely not. By no means. How else can I say this? No, no. So consider an example of a boy whose parents divorced when he was young. Okay, the boy was raised primarily by his mom. As long as mom does not look to her son to meet her emotional needs, then the boy is not being triangulated, even though dad is absent and the boy has a close emotional connection with mom. I know plenty of women who are emotionally closer to their children than to their distant husband or to their ex-husband. This does not necessarily mean that you are harming your child. It doesn't mean that the children are being triangulated. Not necessarily, by no means. Again, here's the question. Does the mother require the child to function as a surrogate spouse in the absence of dad? Many people grew up in families where the dynamics changed over time. Okay, your family structure, it changed from when you were 3 to 10 to 18. So your parents may have divorced. One parent may have died. Your older sister may have been triangulated by your dad for much of your life, but then she went away to college and suddenly dad required you to fill that role. There's lots of different family constellations and family structures change over time. Here's the point. The invitation today is not to categorize yourself as I was triangulated or I was not triangulated. That's not what I'm driving at. The question is this. Here's the question. In what season of your life did you experience some measure of triangulation with one of your parents? And how might that be affecting your sexuality today? Because triangulation affects sexuality, and we'll get into that in a minute. It is important to remember that you have experienced both intentional harm and unintentional harm, okay? Triangulation is about a sustained pattern of relating between a parent and the so-called chosen child. Relational dynamics are established over years of time. It doesn't just happen once or twice or 10 times. It's a sustained pattern of relating. So look, isolated incidents may be unintentional, but patterns of relating are not. When there's a pattern of relating, like you're the only sibling that goes out in the garage with dad to work on the car, that's a pattern. Isolated incidents may be unintentional, but patterns of relating are not. Moreover, if you do not believe that the harm was intentional, you still have to grapple with the impact. even if you don't believe that the harm was intentional, you've got to grapple with the impact. The impact on your precious heart of being required to meet your parents' emotional needs is severe. The impact is severe. Children are not designed to do that. Okay. Okay. Now that I've explained those two caveats, I want to go back to triangulation. Let's flesh this out. Triangulation results in two deadly dynamics. Number one, first, your goodness is consumed by one of your parents. And number two, as a result of being consumed by parent A, you are set up to be envied by parent B. Whether it's biological parent, step parent, whatever. Consumed by one parent, envied by the other. If your parents were not each other's best friend, if there was not a passionate love and care and concern between them, then you may know something about being consumed and you may know something about being envied. By consumption, I mean that since your father knew that your mother was not there for him, he began to look to you as a child to fill his emotional needs. He began to consume, to use the goodness that you brought with your attuned presence, your attunement to him, your care for him, your emotional connection with him. Triangulation, this is so important to understand. It places an immense burden on the chosen child. However, the chosen child rarely feels a sense of burden at the time. Quite the opposite of feeling a sense of burden. To the child, the relationship will feel loving and sweet and close and connected. As an adult, okay, you will think back on your childhood and you will probably remember being highly attuned to the parent who triangulated you. You'll remember anticipating their needs, reading them well when they were upset, being there for them, being like a confidant and companion for them. You will feel close, in other words, to the parent who made you into a surrogate spouse. However, there is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it services the needs and feelings of the parent rather than the child. If you were triangulated, then the nature of your story is this: what felt like love wasn't. This is very hard to come to terms with. And to make matters worse, a triangulated child is not only used by one parent, they're not only consumed by one parent, they're also like put at odds with, at enmity with the other parent. So in my story, look, I was consumed by my mother. I was triangulated by my mother. I was her confidant, her surrogate spouse. But what do you think my father thought about the fact that my mother preferred me over him? I mean, do you see the setup? I was set up by my mother to be envied by my father. My father, understandably, viewed me as a rival. Kenneth Adams wrote a very helpful book on this topic called Silently Seduced, and the subtitle is When Parents Make Their Children Partners. I have a link to this book on the books page of my website. You can, if this episode resonates with you, I highly recommend checking out that book. And Kenneth Adams shares some examples in his book of people coming to terms, all right, with the triangulation in their family of origin. And here's how one man puts it in the book Silently Seduced. He says, I decided early on I was going to show my dad I could be a better father than he ever was. Although I didn't know it at the time, I was also working on being a better husband than he was, a role my mother always seemed to welcome. All right, that's a quote. Now notice the dynamic. competition between the son and dad. I was committed to being a better father, and combined with emotional closeness between the son and mom. One of the heart-wrenching realities of children who are triangulated is that it feels really powerful to be able to come through for the parent who is treating you like a surrogate spouse. I mean, it feels so good. Think of what an ego trip this is for a child, a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old. Here's another quote from Silently Seduced. Consider this man's experience. He writes, "It felt so good to be able to make my mom stop crying and put a smile on her face. I was more than willing to be there for her. I felt so important and powerful. After a while, it seemed that my mother actually preferred my company over my father's." All right, that's the excerpt. When this man was a boy, it felt good for him to be able to comfort his mother. Of course it did. He felt important and powerful. He felt special. All right, one more example. Here's an example of a woman looking back on her relationship with her dad. "My father always had me by his side when I was growing up. I was his little sweetie. He and my mother didn't have much of a relationship, so I was the object he adored. When I was younger, I enjoyed all the attention and closeness." Okay, that she's writing about, in retrospect, her experience of being triangulated by her dad. Now, notice the language. She enjoyed all the attention and closeness. Look, of course she did. Of course, who wouldn't? And there was goodness in it, but it was also deeply violating. Why? Because her dad looked to her instead of looking to mom for emotional connection. What did this woman write? She was the object dad adored, not mom. Now, look, that wreaks havoc in a girl's heart, but it's rarely going to feel damaging at the time. This is subtle. This is subtle. If you were triangulated, you likely will not think of yourself as violated or harmed because your relationship, usually with your opposite sex parent, felt good, felt sweet. My relationship with my mom sure as hell felt good, felt very sweet. And look, that relationship with the opposite sex parent definitely felt better than your relationship with your same sex parent, who was often critical of you or distant from you. In fact, very often, if you were triangulated as a boy or a girl, you will live your entire life believing that the parent who triangulated you was the best parent you had. They were the good parent, the other one was the bad parent. Now, let me just make another caveat. I know there have been a lot of them, but this is hard to describe. Please know that you can be triangulated by your same-sex parent. I have worked with lots and lots of women who were required to be their mother's confidant, companion, surrogate spouse. Mom looked to the daughter instead of to her husband, her partner, for emotional closeness, connection. Okay, caveat. Back to triangulation. Consumption, the two deadly dynamics. Consumption is number one. Envy is number two. Deadly dynamic number two. When a child is chosen by one parental figure, the other parental figure comes to often envy the chosen child. Think about this. It is humiliating to know that your spouse, your romantic partner, prefers someone over you, especially when that someone is a child. And as a result, the chosen child frequently bears the contempt and the cruelty of the unchosen parental figure. To make matters worse, if you had siblings and you were triangulated, the chosen child is also put at enmity with those siblings. There's envy from the siblings. All children are created for parental delight. And when one of the children is clearly the favorite of mom or of dad, it doesn't matter, the unchosen siblings understandably burn with envy. And this is, of course, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, the story of Joseph and his brothers, the children of Jacob, who favored Joseph over all the other children. The envy-driven hatred of Joseph's brothers was not primarily because Joseph had a pretty coat, despite what you may have been told, but because Joseph's father preferred Joseph over all the other children. So look, think about your story for a minute. Is there tension or distance between you and one of your parents? Do you know why? Do you know why that tension or distance exists? There is always a reason for interpersonal tension or relational distance. Always. There is a reason you have never felt close to your mother. There is a reason your father was often critical or contemptuous of you at the dinner table during holiday gatherings. In order to experience healing, in order for your story to make sense, you have to identify that reason. Now, it may be triangulation, it may be something else, but today we're just exploring the possibility of triangulation. When you have been triangulated, it can be very hard to name it. When you are required to function like a surrogate spouse to one of your parents, your childhood is stolen. This is because, why? This is because you can't fully be a kid when you are often required to act like an adult, to be an adult, to function like an adult. You can't be a carefree child when you are preoccupied by one of your parents' emotional well-being. You just can't. You can't be a child when you are functioning like an adult. And so your childhood is stolen. Now, bear with me, all right? Hang in there. Next point. I need to talk about what happens when triangulation is sexualized, because it often becomes sexualized. When triangulation is present in a family, it is common, though not inevitable, for the triangulated relationship to become sexualized. What does that mean? By sexualized, I mean that there is erotic energy between mom and the chosen son or dad and the chosen daughter. There are intimate relational dynamics at play in families that we don't tend to think of as erotic, but they are. Eroticism is not merely what happens with genital contact. It's not even primarily what happens with genitalia. Eroticism is far more about the eyes than about the hands. It is more about the energy between two people than about what is happening with body parts. Eroticism pertains to that which makes your body come alive. Now, here are some of the signs that a parental relationship with a child was sexualized, was eroticized. Here are some four signs. One, when you hugged mom or dad, the hugs lasted slightly longer than was comfortable, and or the hugs felt a little gross or a little weird. You felt a little repulsed and you wanted to stop the hug. Number two, sign that a parental relationship was sexualized. Mom or dad made sexually suggestive comments about your body or your appearance. Number three, You felt uncomfortable wearing attractive clothes in front of one of your parents. You just felt a little uncomfortable. So you'd wear baggy sweatshirts. And number four, these are just examples, okay? It's not an exhaustive list. Something felt a little bit off when you danced with mom or dad at your wedding. The wedding dance, ooh, boy, that is a big indicator. And something just felt a little weird. You can't put your finger on it. It just felt a little bit odd. Triangulation that becomes sexualized is properly called subtle sexual abuse. Yes, it is abuse. Yes, sexual abuse is the appropriate term. Why? But first, let me explain the subtle word. It's subtle in that there may not have been any inappropriate physical touch of sexual body parts. All right. It's sexual in that the energy between the adult and the child is erotically charged. Can you be subtly sexually abused if you were never inappropriately touched by someone? If your breasts, your pelvic area was never groped, can you be subtly sexually abused if that never happened? Absolutely, 100%. Again, sexuality is far more about the eyes than the hands and the genitals. Most women, look, if you're a woman and you're listening, most women know what it's like to be gazed upon by lustful eyes that are attempting to sexualize the interaction, to be mentally undressed by a man across a room. You know, the man could be halfway across the room, zero physical touch, zero. And yet it is a sexually violating interaction. For me, I couldn't have named it when I was a boy, right? I couldn't. But at times, there was sexual energy when my mom looked at me and interacted with me. And it felt a little weird. It felt a little gross. It felt a little off. Please understand that the word subtle, when in subtle sexual abuse, in no way equates with the phrase less severe. All right, this is not about severity. Subtlety does not equate with less severe. In my counseling practice, I have found this phenomenon of subtle sexual abuse to be the root of immense torment for many, many people and the root of many problems with sexuality in adulthood. Triangulation, one of the reasons it can be so painful is because it flies under the radar. And once it is reckoned with, it unravels long-held perceptions of our parents and ourselves. Now, before ending, one more last, just hang in there. I wanted to talk to those of you who were not triangulated. You may not have been the triangulated child in your family. If you had siblings, that burden may have fallen to a brother or a sister. However, the fallout from triangulation will still affect you, even if you weren't the triangulated child. Let me give you a vignette. Consider these two sisters. We'll call them Cheryl and Susan. Mom and dad did not have a healthy marriage built on love, companionship, frequent repair of ruptures. That stuff wasn't happening. Instead, mom and dad grew increasingly distant from each other and increasingly contemptuous of one another. And as a result, Cheryl's father, okay, Cheryl's the older sister, her father began to look to Cheryl for emotional support and companionship. He would go to all her field hockey games. And although mom came to some of the games, it was very clear that there was a bond between Cheryl and dad that was closer than the bond between mom and dad. Cheryl was the triangulated child, the chosen child. Susan was the unchosen younger sister. Susan, in other words, was spared the madness of being triangulated by her father. However, she wore the crown of unchosen. She always had a vague sense that her dad preferred her older sister Cheryl. And this awareness was understandably absolutely devastating to Susan. Moreover, throughout her growing up years, Susan felt like a nagging sense of envy and resentment toward her older sister Cheryl, and Susan never knew why. Susan actually liked Cheryl, but sometimes her envy and her resentment would manifest in cruelty towards Cheryl, and she didn't even know why. Susan was left feeling unchosen by her father, and she felt ashamed of her cruelty towards Cheryl. The only quote unquote good thing in Susan's life was that mom was nicer to Susan than she was to Cheryl. All right, that's the vignette. It is hard to overstate the heartache that comes with being unchosen. I mean, it is hard to overstate the heartache that comes with being unchosen. What happens inside the body of a 12-year-old girl as she watches her dad light up when he talks about her older sister, but not when he talks about her? It is a deep agony to hear the warmth in your dad's tone of voice for your older sister, but not for you. And on top of all of that agony, you also bear the heartache of envy, of burning with envy for your older sister. Because of the triangulation, you are robbed of a pure relationship with your older sibling. What could have been a sweet sister to sister relationship is polluted and contaminated because of dad's favoritism. Dad is orchestrating that by triangulating the older sister. I worked with a woman, this is a made up story. I worked with a woman who experienced a very different tucking in ritual than her older sister. All right. Dad was the one in this household who put both sisters to bed each night when they were younger, when they were elementary, middle school. However, after dad tucked in my client, all right, he would go into the kitchen. This was a ritual. It happened all the time. He would slice a red apple and he would carry the slices on a cutting board to my client's older sister's bedroom. And my client, the younger sister, then had to listen as dad and older sister talked about their days and ate their apple slices together. And this happened every night for years. If you are the unchosen sibling, there is debris that you carry in your body because of the heartache of the triangulation with your other sibling. So, for example, let me just give one example. How might Susan, younger sister, Susan's unchosenness affect her sexuality as she grows up? Well, one of the most common ways is that Susan will begin to do anything to be chosen by a man since she wasn't chosen by her father, including using her sexuality to be chosen. Here's the point. You may have been Cheryl in your family, or you may have been Susan. Either way, there is fallout for all of the children when one of the children is triangulated. Okay. Whew. If you made it to the end, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks.